It's interesting to see how much the reputation for 2000s era Sonic has changed in recent years. There were so many creative decisions made in that time period that created a blight on the franchise that it's never really recovered from. And yet, recently, a lot of those same decisions have garnered a newfound appreciation from fans to the point where the franchise is now actively embracing aspects of itself that it spent years trying to sweep under the rug. Mainly stuff to do with Shadow. It's almost like he's a good character or something. One interesting case of this, though, is Sonic and the Black Knight. When this came out, people hated it and said it was one of the worst Sonic games ever made. But I think partially because of the relatively unambitious games that came out in the years after, I've seen people be a little more generous towards it. Nowadays, people tend to say that, yeah, the game wasn't good, but it had a lot of stellar elements and one of the best stories in the series. On the one hand, I am happy to see that there are more nuanced takes popping up as opposed to videos that just openly admit that they're not giving the game a fair chance.
This game sucks. I've never played this in my life.
Are you serious?
I actually literally don't know anything about it.
On the other hand, while I'm happy to see that people are able to find the good in this game, I could not disagree with them more. Okay, well, let's start with what I doubt is a controversial opinion. The gameplay is just as bad as people said it was when it released. The game, much like its predecessor, Sonic and the Secret Rings, is on rails. Sonic runs forward on a predetermined route, and your main control of him comes from steering and jumping to avoid obstacles, and slashing your newfangled sword to attack enemies. And because the control scheme is so dependent on just running in a straight line, it makes the combat significantly more shallow than it otherwise might have been. In a lot of hack and slash games, the mechanics heavily revolve around dodging and outmaneuvering your enemies. But when your only available direction to move in is straight toward the enemy, and they don't have much in the way of mobility either, there isn't a ton of complexity to fighting them. In fact, the enemies have so little movement ability that a lot of the time I just decided I couldn't be bothered to fight them and just jumped right over them because that's just a thing you can do. The combat is terrible, like genuinely awful. Any skill or strategy is almost completely non-existent. There are different abilities and different enemy types, but your approach to fighting them will almost invariably be the exact same. I spent the vast majority of the game using a jump slice over and over because it was a quick way of dispatching large lines of enemies with very little effort. You might have noticed I said lines of enemies there, and that leads me to kind of an interesting question. Why did this game need to retain the on-rails design of Secret Rings? In that game, there was at least a reason for it, in that the game was played using the Wii Remote on its side to steer. It was trading off a more in-depth control scheme for the novelty of motion controls like a lot of early Wii games did.
Finally, something interesting.
It wasn't a good reason for things to feel so limited, but there at least was a reason. Here though, Sonic is controlled using the Wii Remote and Nunchuck. You know, the controller is used for pretty much every 3D platformer on the Wii. With a much more limited control scheme out the window, there is no excuse for the level design to be so bare bones this time around. The boss fights are really the only significant times when any complexity is given to the combat, and even then it's still not particularly well designed. I'll give credit that they put up a fight, but there isn't much in the way of discernible attack patterns or visual cues, which makes it almost impossible to predict and react to them. There was one fight where I picked up on an attack pattern, but after that, the boss fight just devolved into this. Even looking past the swordplay, the level design beyond that doesn't get much better. You're given very little reason to steer throughout the stages, platforming is pretty minimal, and a lot of the more interesting movement is automated. How fantastic. There's an upgrade shop, which, I'll be honest, I paid virtually zero attention to. I mean, when the vast majority of stages can already be cleared while paying very little attention, how much easier could the upgrades possibly make it? I like that the music there is a cover of Tails' theme from Sonic Adventure though, that's a nice touch. And as if the gameplay wasn't already lacking in substance, the game itself is extraordinarily short. You can beat the main story in about 2.5 hours. That last criticism stuck with me for a while because I initially wasn't sure why it bothered me so much. I mean, there are plenty of short Sonic games, and a lot of those still manage to be seen as the best in the series. Colors, Generations, even the early Genesis games. I think the difference with Black Knight, though, is that those games are pretty light on story. They're fairly straightforward stage-to-stage platformers with the occasional cutscene to remind you that there is indeed a plot. With a structure like that, the game, to a certain extent, can get away with being any length it wants. Black Knight, though, is attempting to have a somewhat in-depth plot, but the short length makes the pacing feel incredibly off. The characters explicitly say that the plot takes place over the course of a few days, but it genuinely feels closer to just one afternoon with how breakneck every plot point is introduced and resolved. And that brings me to the main thing that I wanted to talk about. Like I said, a lot of Sonic fans have argued that the story in Black Knight is actually pretty good, and I went into making this video assuming that I was going to do the same. But I'm sorry, I just don't think it's particularly well done. I'm not at a complete loss as to why people like this story. I know people argue that Sonic is characterized pretty well, and sure, there are moments when I can agree. The premise involves the world of the Arthurian legend, in which King Arthur has become a tyrannical ruler, and the Knights of the Round Table, who are meant to protect the kingdom, instead assist in maintaining his rule. Not because they condone it, but simply because their code mandates it.
The king's orders are absolute.
Yes, but
Without loyalty to the king, we are nothing. Still, the king, he has changed. And this kingdom.
Sonic is summoned to slay Arthur and save the kingdom, even convincing the knights along the way that sometimes breaking the rules is necessary. As Sonic stories go, this has potential, and I think it's a good use of Sonic as a character. Sort of this heroic rebel that stands for freedom above an oppressive system. And there are times when that shines through. I especially like the scene where Sonic is warned that defeating King Arthur would lead to him being branded a villain, and he just shrugs it off.
If you remove that sword and defeat King Arthur with it, you shall forever be the worst of knights, slayer of kings.
guess I can't be the hero every time.
It's a good indicator of how happily he'll disrupt the establishment if the world at large will be better for it. He's fine with making enemies if it means that other people can have the freedom that he values so much. But while these themes are interesting, there's very little attention given to stakes. King Arthur, despite apparently ruling the kingdom with an iron fist, has virtually no presence throughout the story. We fight his minions throughout the game, but there's very little sign of the oppression he supposedly created. There are towns and settlements throughout the game, but how they're affected by Arthur's rule isn't elaborated on. There's a mission when Sonic frees the townspeople from Arthur's dungeon, but there's no backstory or context given for that, which, for a story all about liberating a world, there's not much indication on what it's being liberated from. But hey, even if the story isn't all that deep, maybe the presentation can pick up the slack. After all, that is another thing that people seem to really like about the game. And yeah, for the most part, it's pretty good. The music is great, as is to be expected from Sonic. Night of the Wind is one of my favorite Crush 40 songs, and I like how some of the tracks from previous Sonic games get incorporated. Like, for example, when Sonic shows one last act of defiance, standing to face the final boss after everyone tells him to flee, and his theme song, It Doesn't Matter from Sonic Adventure, starts playing.
I just gotta do what I've gotta do! That's all! Sonic!
The visuals are generally pretty good for a Wii game, particularly the odd CGI cutscene, which still looks stellar over a decade later. I don't mind the Sonic movies, but I desperately wish they were more like this. The storybook cutscenes are also pretty nice looking. They're almost certainly done to save on budget, but I can admire Sonic Team for doing that in such a stylized way that fits the game thematically, and it looks a lot better than other attempts to save on animation budgets in this franchise.
This is why it's called Storybook Chronicles.
This is awesome.
As an excuse for their low budget and their shitty graphics.
Right.
Or you could approach it through the lens of looking for stuff to complain about, because it's okay when you're doing it to Sonic, apparently. But while the game is visually impressive, I can't help but feel like the look of these stages aren't all that distinct. There are a few memorable zones, like this mine in a volcano and this wooden fortress, but most of the stages are just generic medieval settings like Castle Town, Lake, Forest, Cave, Field. It looks technically nice, but it's not entirely selling me on this world that I was already struggling to get invested in. Well, either way though, there is one last element that I see people praising quite a lot, and it's the plot twist that comes up in the game's last third. Okay, so actually finding this part of the story is one thing. Sonic games have this habit of playing the end credits multiple times throughout the game, but it's usually done in games where there's multiple story campaigns, so it kind of makes sense. Here though, Sonic defeats the Black Knight, says zippity-doo-dah, and then it abruptly cuts to credits, even though there's like at least a good hour of game left. The story doesn't even continue automatically after the credits finished. You just get booted back to the main menu without any indication of where to go or what to do. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people got genuinely confused on their first time playing. But okay, the twist involves one of Sonic's allies named Merlina revealing that she was just manipulating Sonic into defeating Arthur, so she could take his powers for herself.
I shall make this kingdom eternal.
So Sonic and the Knights put aside their differences and team up to defeat her. First of all, I'm not fond of what this does for the Knights' character arcs. The whole idea with them is that they're meant to eventually learn to stand for freedom after Sonic gets through to them and not enforce Arthur's oppressive rule.
A knight who fails their king is unfit to live. Isn't there more to being a knight than just serving a king? Huh?
But now that they're finally teaming up with Sonic, it's not because they've learned to stand against Arthur. Arthur's not even a factor in the plot at this point. It's only because their goals just happen to align with Sonic's at that particular moment. The fate of the world is at stake and they've got no other allegiances. Why wouldn't they team up with Sonic? As for Merlina's plan, I see people say that this is a decent twist because it genuinely caught them by surprise. But if I may be so bold, that's not exactly difficult to do when the twist has virtually no build-up. There's one scene where Merlina seems vaguely unhappy about a flower wilting, but it's a bit of a leap from that to freezing reality in one state of being for all eternity.
But I can succeed with the power of the scabbard, creating a kingdom that never ends.
I think part of the problem is that the concepts of nothing lasting forever and appreciating something while it lasts were never really prominent themes in the story until this point. So Merlina feels less like a new threat naturally emerging from the old one, and more like the game just abandoning the old one in favor of something completely different. But the biggest problem for me in terms of making this world eternal is that it's not really made clear what that actually means in practice. Why won't the world just continue to evolve? What's stopping the inhabitants from just continuing on with their lives and making changes to the world through just existing? Much like Arthur's rule, it's just a case of a threat not being given the proper context, and it ruins any investment I might have had. Now, as much as I've talked about elements that people like, I will acknowledge that the game as a whole still isn't regarded as being very good, and like I mentioned, there are some people that will use that as an excuse to not go in with an open mind. But as someone who has listened to both positive and negative opinions on this game, and played it for myself considering all aspects of it as fairly as I can, this game sucks. I really wanted to say that this game had a lot going for it. The premise is pretty cool, and it had some legitimately good ideas for exploring Sonic's ideology. Not to mention, the introducing of hack and slash elements to Sonic gameplay is a really intriguing idea. I just don't think any of it is implemented all that well. It doesn't give me any pleasure to say that. If anything, I think it's a shame that such a great idea like the storybook series didn't amount to much. But hey, with how willing this franchise has been recently to bring back old ideas that didn't work, maybe we'll see something like it again someday. On a personal note, I can't begin to stress how much I would love a Sonic and Alice in Wonderland crossover, but until that theoretical day ever comes, I can't say I'm all that happy with what I got. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters Heather Reed, Zelda, Radio Peyo, and Moon Goddesses. Thank you so much for the support.